relationship. I'm an optimist. I'm an optimist about America. I'm an optimist about India. I'm an optimist about the U.S. relationship. And there are good reasons for that optimism. Our people-to-people ties, grounded in education and shared commitments to the rule of law, diversity, and open societies, are a critical foundation upon which the bilateral relationship stands. In the 20 years and more that I have been working with India, education has been a cornerstone of that relationship, and I'm confident it will remain that way well into the future. Both our nations benefit immensely from our partnership in higher education, the sharing of ideas, and the joint research. And we have a long history of collaboration in the field of higher education. This year marks 2 important anniversaries in our higher education relationship. First, it is the 70th anniversary of the Fulbright program in India. This bilateral program has facilitated the exchange of thousands of students and scholars between our 2 nations and thrives today. And this year marks the 60th anniversary of the Kanpur Indo-American program, otherwise known as KIAP. The US and India, through KIAP, laid the foundation for IIT Kanpur to be among the leading higher education institutions in the world that it is today. The KIAP story represents some of the best of our historic relationship. We struck a partnership in 1960 that helped establish one of the best university systems in the world, in partnership with some of our best universities: MIT, Berkeley, Caltech, Princeton, the Carnegie Institute of Technology, the University of Michigan, Ohio State, Case Institute of Technology, and Purdue University. That success gave unprecedented educational opportunities to hundreds of thousands of Indians and helped fuel India's emergence as a global leader in technology and science. It also contributed directly to the dramatic and powerful people-to-people ties that have blossomed between our 2 nations, growing from just people to ideas, technology, and economic growth. And it is a testimony to the potential for our higher education partnership today and into the future lecture series on the future of higher education. The U.S. Embassy is grateful to our esteemed partner, the Association of Indian Universities, who have collaborated to implement this special series for Indian academicians and administrators. I express my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Tej Pratap, the newly appointed president of AIU, and Dr. Pankaj Mittal, the Secretary General of the Association of Indian Universities, and a former Fulbright scholar, who join us today. In this series, American higher education leaders will present their perspectives on crucial issues facing higher education today and into the future. And I'm joined today by my colleague Carl Adam, the first Secretary of Education and Culture, who will moderate today's session along with Dr. Mittal. Now, what you've been waiting for, I have the honor to introduce today's speaker. We are very pleased to have Professor Sanjay Sarma, the Vice President for Open Learning and Professor of Mechanical Engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Professor Sarma is an accomplished scholar and the first Director of Digital Learning at MIT, perhaps the most important role at an institution today. Professor Sarma earned his bachelor's degree from the prestigious Indian Institute of Technology at Kanpur, his master's from Carnegie Mellon University, and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. He represents the best of the US-India partnership in higher education. Dr. Sarma, thank you for taking your time to join us today, and we and the entire audience is eager to listen to you. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. It's such a pleasure to be here. As you just said, I'm in fact a graduate of IIT Kanpur. I'm at MIT. There are several IIT Kanpur graduates or professors at MIT. In addition, Professor Mriganka Sur, Professor Arvind, Professor Arup Chakraborty, and most recently, and joining this fall, Professor Faiz Ahmed. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen, and then we will kick this off. As I said, it's a pleasure and an honor to be speaking to our friends and colleagues in India. The future of learning is very fascinating. I'll speak for about 30 minutes or so, but obviously I won't be able to cover the entire arc of the story that I think that needs to be told. We are at a junction point between the past and the future. I often joke that the 21st century did not begin in 2020. It is beginning today, because we will refer to the era before, this COVID period as BC. Now, even before COVID, it was fascinating what was happening in the world economy. On the one hand, if you look at the progress of technologies going back 100 years, you will see that when you look at the telephone, which is to the extreme left, you can see that it started in the 1900s, but it only reached full penetration about 30 years ago, maybe 50 years ago. But then if you look if you glance to the right, you will see that new technologies have been adopted much more rapidly. First it was the telephone, then it was things like radio, the fridge, credit cards. And then when you get to the tablet, you can see how rapid and steep the adoption is. So what this means is that new jobs over the course of a century have been created more rapidly and even more rapidly. So for example, a fridge technician was a job that did not exist 70 years ago. And yet suddenly it became a new job and you had to be retrained. On the other hand, what's been happening is that these technologies are accelerating very rapidly and older technologies are dying, which means that there is a massive shift in skills that is required. The chart to the right is from The Economist, and it talks about a different trend, which is the growth of individual companies or self-employed companies or self-employment situations. So what you see there is over time in the last 20 years, both in the United Kingdom and the United States, owner-proprietors have grown. And this is the rise of freelancing. It is also called the gig economy. It doesn't refer just to, or although not to demean that, it doesn't refer to workers on Instacart. In the US today with the COVID lockdown, a lot of people who've lost their jobs are working on Instacart. And Uber, driving Uber cars and so on, or Uber Eats more likely, but also things like freelancing software developers on Upwork, or freelancing designers and logo designers on other platforms. So these two trends are very profound, because what they mean is that if you work for yourself and you have to learn skills very rapidly, traditional education system may or may not be ready for it, because you need to upgrade your skills while you're working on another job, and you may not be able to go back to school. And the whole edifice that we've built in modern education, which is 4 years of education and you're done, becomes a little bit suspect. Imagine if I said to you that you can work out for 4 years of your life and you're fit for the rest of your life. Well, we know that isn't true. And we know that we need to take care of ourselves every week and every day, and go to the gym or get some exercise to stay fit. Fitness doesn't last forever, neither does a skill, because skills are vanishing and people have to work for themselves. The other point here is that you also are going to have to become the CEO of your own life, and to a large extent the CLO. The term CLO refers to the Chief Learning Officer. And what that means is it doesn't matter what degrees you have. If you're a freelancer, what matters is your customer happy with your work, and is the customer likely to hire you again? So with that in mind, that was before COVID. Let's look at what happened with COVID. Well, COVID has fundamentally changed everything. On the one hand, a bunch of industries have been positively impacted. The Googles, the Zooms, the Netflixes of the world. Online commerce is obviously booming. We're all hanging by a thread here, which is telecommunications. Healthcare has gone tele. So now doctors, even in the United States, are fine with you calling in. That's something they would not have countenanced a few months ago. Biotech is going to boom, shared office space, and of course, local supply chains. More and more nations are looking at their own local supply chains rather than looking internationally. And negatively impacted are a whole bunch of industries: retail, commercial real estate, airlines, obviously hotels, restaurants. One of the interesting things is that if you live in a big hub city like in Gurgaon or Noida or Bangalore or San Francisco or Boston and pay huge rents, the fact that you can work remotely means that the hub cities are going to be negatively impacted. People will flee what are called the super zips in America. The zip, of course, is the pin code in America. So that's an impact. And finally, internationalism has definitely taken a back seat, and it will remain so, except between countries that are friendly to each other. And that is the point of today's presentation. The other thing that's happened is that as people are out of work in these negatively impacted industries, they're going to have to shift to the positively impacted industries. And again, that speaks to the power and importance of education. Education should no longer seen as the sort of thing that you send a 19-year-old to. Education is a resiliency measure to keep our economies afloat, all economies afloat. So with that, I'd like to now talk about education. I'm going to speak a little bit about what it means. And really, we need to go back a little bit to the raison d'etre. Why does education exist? And, if you look at the, 300-400 years ago, education was not there for degrees. The degree is a made-up concept. It comes from about 1,000 years ago. The European degree system borrows from the Islamic degree system. And in the Islamic degree system, it is called the ijazat, which is permission. And so the degree system of Europe was created to sort of guarantee that you had skills for your life. But now we need to focus on knowledge transfer, which is continuous, as opposed to a single exam that somehow prepares you for life. Of course, degrees will remain important for some time, but this is an important trend. And to understand all this, I'm going to put up a fairly formidable looking picture here, but you only need to look at the red patch in the front of this, cartoon human being's face. And that front patch is called the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the most recent evolutionary addition to the brain, and only humans have it. And what it is the CEO of the brain, is the executive function of the brain. And it is a thing that is a meta. In other words, it is the thought that controls other thoughts. And it's interesting, as someone who grew up in India, in Indian culture, particularly in certain religions, there is the concept of the third eye. And you might argue that that's some sort of, recognition of this prefrontal cortex. And we all do it naturally. We point at our forehead and we say, I need to think. And that's because that's the prefrontal cortex. We have some sort of awareness of it. We don't point to the back of our head. We point to the front of our head. Now, what's happened over the last 40 years is breakthroughs in our understanding of the human brain. And they involve things like functional MRI. So functional MRI is MRI, but what Mossy, who's discovered, was that you can actually determine which part of a brain is active in different activities. When you're listening to music, watching a TV show, reading, studying, being creative. And over the course of the next 30, 40 years, a very international group of scientists, including well-known icons like Linus Pauling, developed a whole theory which really came down to the fact that you can use an MRI machine, have people do different things, and figure out which part of their brain is working very hard. And this has transformed our understanding of the human brain and neuroscience. MIT has one of the top neuroscience departments in the world. And every day, I should say every week, we discover something very interesting. And this could be things like, where dyslexia comes from or ADHD comes from, all the way to, which part of the brain wakes up when we're listening to music or doing something creative. Why is this important? The reason this is important is if you look at the history of education today, it is based largely on the lecture format. This is a painting. You can find this on Wikipedia from Bologna in the 14th century AD. And what you see there is a professor standing at a lectern giving a lecture. And you can see students watching. And you can see a couple of the students have snoozed off, they've fallen asleep, as often happens in lectures and classrooms around the world today. The fact is the lecture format is extremely resilient. It has existed for about 700 years. And it really got baked into our ethos during the European Industrial Revolution. What happened was that in countries like Britain, you had to train folks coming in from rural areas to operate the machines. And equally importantly, you had to provide childcare for their children and train them to become the next generation of Industrial Revolution machine operators, or clerks for the colonial empire. And and that's how the system spread. And this lecture format got baked in. But you see, it's based on a very fundamental flaw in our reasoning or understanding of how learning occurs. The flaw is this: it is based on an assumption that the mind is a sheet of paper for a professor to write on. So the mental model is the professor is holding this really long pen, and he treats the students, in this case it's a man, and the students are men as well, it is 13th century, 14th century. He treats the students as if they were just empty sheets of paper and he can just go write on those sheets of paper. And if the students don't pay attention, you can yell at them or scold them and say, why aren't you paying attention? But that's actually a very flawed understanding of how learning works. The actual way that learning works, and I'm going to use a cartoon here to explain it, is you should think of it as we call it constructivism at MIT, but the term that is often used is constructionism. What really happens is, and I'm going to use gold coins as metaphors for information. And on the right, you see a treasury, or as we would say in Hindi, a khajana, but it's neatly organized. And that is your knowledge in your brain. So what happens is life serves up bits of information. Education serves up bits of information. Remember, education is much more recent. Most of the bits of information came in from life. You discovered that if you did A, a reward appeared in the form of B. For example, you planted a seed, you got a crop, or where this plant resulted in this curative benefit. So, and we map that. So the thing is that knowledge comes in as these gold coins, fistfuls. And in between, and this is the cartoon, is our executive function, the prefrontal cortex that I showed you earlier, picks up that information. Actually, it's more complicated than that. The executive function actually recruits a part of the brain called the hippocampus and forms short-term memories. But just for the sake of this cartoonish description, which actually is a pretty good analogy, think of it this way. This little leprechaun, the executive function, picks up the information and then integrates it, makes sense of it, and then stacks it away in the treasury, the khajana. That leprechaun is the thing in the front of your head, the prefrontal cortex. It's the executive function. And that business of reorganizing the information is called consolidation, integration, sense-making, saliency. And that is the process by which we actually create knowledge, we absorb knowledge. Now, the problem that our education system has is it ignores the agency of that prefrontal cortex, the leprechaun. And I like to joke, what happens to a leprechaun if you don't treat him well and he gets tired? Well, he's going to take a nap. And in fact, what we find is that in learning, the same thing happens. After about 10 minutes of absorbing a lecture, the student's mind wanders. And the only way to wake the leprechaun again, wake up the prefrontal cortex again, is actually to provide something called intrinsic motivation, which is, first of all, give the poor guy a break. And then second, make the leprechaun excited and curious. Though I'll come back to the word curiosity later. What we have focused on in education in the past is extrinsic motivation, which is a form of, it's a form of do this or else, a little bit of a threat, a little bit of a scold. But it turns out our education works really well with intrinsic motivation. Video games have figured this out. The kids love to play because they're curious, they love it. But education has not figured this out. In fact, if you look at the philosophers, Thoreau and Alcott and Emerson, they figured this out. Actually, in my neck of the woods here in Boston, about 100 years ago, Maria Montessori figured it out. To India's benefit, Maria Montessori was stuck in India for about 10 years, a few years during World War II because she was Italian. And there were a bunch of Montessori schools that were set up. I benefited from one of those. And the Indian philosopher Jiddu Krishnamurti figured it out. And he set up a school in Madanapalli in the south of India called Rishi Valley, where, as it turns out, much of my family went. But it's all based on this recognition that it is intrinsic motivation drives education, and our education system today is based on extrinsic motivation. There's actually quite a myriad of incredible cognitive psychology principles that we have completely ignored. In fact, most professors don't even know about. I won't go through them all, but I'll give you little tidbits on each, on a few. But let me start by one little thing. This is the concept of mind wandering. So in fact, that is a technical term. The even more technical term is something called default mode. But what happens is when a person is attentive to something, when they're curious, when they're excited, when they're reading something they're excited about, their brain, the executive function is in full flow, and the prefrontal cortex is where the thoughts occur. But after some time, the thoughts, about 10 minutes later, remember 10 minutes is the period, which by the way, I've violated already in the Zoom lecture just because that's the format. But after 10 minutes, the brain goes into mind wandering mode. And mind wandering is actually in some ways good. It's creative, it connects the dots, etc. You can see the thoughts bouncing around in this functional MRI of the brain. Mind wandering is when it's actually daydreaming. And that's when the teacher wags a finger at the student and says, stop daydreaming. But actually daydreaming is good. It isn't so bad because the student's connecting the dots. Having said that, sometimes mind wandering, if it isn't controlled, can lead to negative ideation. So when it goes too far, it becomes depression. And here's the interesting connection to Indian culture. The one way we know to control mind wandering is in fact mindfulness, also called meditation. In fact, there is now science that shows that some mind wandering is good. We should expect our students to do it after about 10 minutes. In fact, after 10 minutes of lecture, we should take a gap, which I've completely violated. And of course, which we never do in any university. We just plow on. But too much mind wandering is bad, and you can control it with meditation. But all these principles, which I'll give, as I said, I'll give you some tidbits of, are just facts of life, which we completely ignore in modern education. Here's another one. So just look at the graph here and look at the green line. What the green line says is, as a lecture becomes longer, up to about 10 minutes, a student will stay with it. They'll keep watching. After 10 minutes, not only do the student stop watching, but if the student knows the lecture is longer than 10 minutes, they actually stop earlier. What that means is the optimal length of a lecture is about 10 minutes. And we absolutely don't know how to do a 10-minute lecture because it takes 10 minutes for a class to sit down and start paying attention. So just imagine if at the end of 10 minutes you have to break a lecture. We do not know how to do it. But the fact is, if you don't want to tempt mind wandering, you have to break lectures in 10 minutes. And we, as I said, we've ignored it for 200 years. As it turns out, you can actually do that on video, online. Online videos do that. Asynchronous videos, you can pause them also, but you can. But most videos are actually about 10 minutes. If you look at a Khan Academy or edX video, we focus on shorter videos because we know this. We knew it instinctively, but now the science bears it out as well. And it has to do with the executive function and the hippocampus. Here's another little tidbit. So it's a complicated graph, but I'll just put it to you this way. So it turns out that when you learn something, the first time you learn something, the human brain is designed and incented to forget it. It is absolutely designed to forget it. In fact, forgetting is a fundamental part of learning. And why is the human brain designed to forget things? Let me ask you a question. Does any of you remember the temperature of a doorknob you touched this morning? Probably not. And the reason is most information that the brain gets is useless. So the brain is actually designed to forget stuff. And what Ebbinghaus, who's one of the great first psychologists, showed was that the way to get long-term memory is to remind the student just about the time they're about to forget it. Just about the time they're going to get rusty with information. And then to do it again. So if you learn something, remind me tomorrow, remind me a week from now, remind me a month from now, remind me a year from now, and I'll probably remember it for the rest of my life. That's called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. In modern education, we completely ignore it. In fact, we wag a finger at a student who's forgetting. But I'm telling you, forgetting is a pathway to remembering. You have to remind people. And just so you know, this has been recreated in things like fruit flies. Fruit flies have figured this out. So that's the basic idea. This is called space retrieval. And we can actually track it down to the way neurons work. Fruit flies, tapeworms, they all have the same neurons, and they all have this thing where if you let them forget and then remind them, they remember longer. But we never do this in regular education because, first of all, most people don't even know about it. And second, it would be inconvenient. How do you tell every little student that, listen, you're about to forget, let me remind you, but a lot of software, like language learning tools like Rosetta Stone and Babbel, they know it and they do it. The third is interleaved learning. Okay, this is a complicated graph, but let me just tell you what it is. So let's say you're teaching a student how to calculate the surface area of a sphere and the surface area of a cone. The right way, it turns out, to teach it is to teach cone, sphere, cone, sphere, cone, sphere. And the reason for that is because the human brain is activated, our learning is activated by differences because we have to reload the formula. But every textbook and every lecture in every classroom around the world is organized around a given topic. Cone, 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 sphere, sphere, sphere. And it turns out that that is not the right way to teach. And we ignore it because it's inconvenient. By the way, when I prepared for IIT, I took a coaching system called Agarwal's. And Agarwal's, if I recall, did some of this. It was actually quite fascinating. I thought the prep for entrance exams, where they really focus on fundamentals, is really good. Okay, here's another one. Very fascinating. So when we are hungry, the human body releases, the mouth releases saliva. Now, there was a study conducted actually at MIT by one of my colleagues. Gabrieli et al. You was the first author in this paper. She was a grad student, I think. What they discovered was, and again, it's a complicated graph, but I'll just explain it. What they discovered was that there was a particular set of brain waves, alpha, gamma, theta waves, which corresponded to a good learning state, and a particular different set of brain waves that predictably and repeatedly corresponded to a poor learning state. And as they were trying to figure this out, they said, why does this happen? They did notice that the good learning state released more dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter like serotonin. And it's called the dopaminergic circuit. It was activated by this good learning state. But they couldn't figure out what this good learning state was. And so they published it. And a few years later, I found this reference and I've shared it with my colleagues. What they discovered was, what another colleague discovered, this is Charan Ranganath's group in the University of California, was that in fact, the good learning state is triggered by an emotional state. And that emotional state is curiosity. And this is fascinating. What this means is if you make a student curious, the rest will follow, because the curiosity releases dopamine. The dopamine means the student is ready to learn. And if you don't focus on curiosity, the rest of it is going to be significantly less effective. This is another thing I don't think we do enough in education. And this is why students love, for example, video games, because it triggers, it actually hits something called the limbic system in the brain, the reward system. And it's not curiosity, but something similar. It triggers an aspect of the brain that is somewhat addictive, actually. Here's another one. So embodied cognition. The basic idea here is, and actually this is something where Indian philosophy figured this out, 1,500 years ago, which is the mind-body connection. So Descartes, the French philosopher, he was trying to fight off, he along with Galileo, etc., were being suppressed by the church. And so to sort of defend themselves, they proposed that the mind is the only thing that matters. It's called the Descartesian philosophy. And then, meanwhile, the Indian philosophers had come up with the thought that, in fact, the mind and body are connected. And that's why in India, you have meditation and yoga. So what we have now discovered is that the body is a very fundamental aspect of learning. So if you learn with your mind and you do it with your hands, then the motor cortex gets engaged and the learning is much stronger. There's a lot of research about this. Very interesting that this idea too is now being proven by science. And this is called embodied cognition. And I'll talk about this in a moment as well. None of this, all of this is so important, but a lot of this takes a backseat in our modern education. And the reason it takes a backseat is because it's so inconvenient, and our exam system sort of drives everything, which is fine. I'm not against exams per se. I've said earlier, competitive exams are good, if they concentrate on fundamentals, but they're not the whole deal, and we miss a lot. I actually have a book coming out in a couple of months called Grasp, which addresses some of the science of learning. And I wrote it actually over the course of 5 or 6 years, because I grew increasingly frustrated with this lack of understanding of some of these principles. So now in the next few minutes, next 3 or 4 minutes, I'm going to talk about how I think education will change. So what I have here is a table, and on the left, I have all the things that sort of need to occur, including some of the principles I described to you. Lectures, retrieval effect is this idea, is a concept that if you learn something, you learn better if someone immediately asks you questions about it, as you might do with your children, by the way. I should also say that a lot of the science of learning mirrors your experiences as a child or a parent. If you think about it, education is an evolutionary prerogative of human beings. And so it shouldn't be surprising that a lot of the science actually reflects what parenting and children and childhood is all about. And actually we ignore those lessons in the classroom, but you know some of these things instinctively. Space repetition, which is recognizing the importance of forgetting. I won't go through all the examples, but by the way, if you look at the fourth row from the bottom, context and intent. If you tell a student why they're learning something, it so makes it more relevant to them. Curiosity, I've talked about. A lot of research on coaching. It turns out that the one thing we can actually make a difference with in education is coaching and hands-on learning, which is embodied cognition. The problem right now is our entire education system is focused on lectures. It's in person, so the columns are in person, online, and the fourth column to the right is something we actually don't do well at all today, or we don't know about. Most educators don't know about. So today, the entire education system is focused on lectures. And the reason is we think somehow that the professor with the pen can write on the student's sheet of paper their brain and prepare them for exams. And exams have driven a lot of what we do. And all these other things we don't do well at all today. Either we do them okay, not great. My IIT experience is actually very good, but in general, we don't do a very good job, or we don't even do it at all because we don't know about it. Now, what's happening during COVID is because lectures are basically the essence of the classroom, we just put those lectures on Zoom. And for universities that are congratulating themselves saying, we did so well online, I'm saying to you, in fact, your success on Zoom is a clear indicator of, frankly, the limitations of your education system. It should not have been that easy. Because, and by the way, it's not good online either. So at MIT, we have a lot of online education. And what we do with that is it's not a Zoom lecture. It's an asynchronous video, well-produced, with, you see on the right, a transcript. This gentleman, Eric Landers, is the person who one of the two groups, he led the group, one of the two groups that sequenced the human genome, very highly produced with graphics, with 3D, with assessments. And that's true online. And Zoom is neither here nor there. It's neither good university nor good online. And so I just want to tell you that please don't think that what we're doing today is the right thing to do. It is a complete compromise and a very unfortunate one. It is the worst of both worlds. Because really what we need to do is we should not be doing lectures in person. When nature releases proximity back to us, the proximity that it's confiscated from us, I hope to God that we don't go back to doing lectures that you could have done on Zoom, except everyone sitting in front of each other. Because the future is that lectures need to go online because students can pause them, rewind them, and so on. And in fact, a lot of these cognitive psychology tricks that I described to you can also go online. As I said to you, like language learning programs like Babbel and Rosetta Stone and Duolingo, they use these tricks. We can do them online. But what we should do in person, and this is the future of the university, is the things that online can't do and that we don't do today, which is coaching, curiosity, hands-on learning, context and intent. Because that's where you really learn and internalize skills and you're ready for the modern world. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is what I call a flipped university. If you just put the lectures online, it's called a flipped classroom. But I think that universities have to completely invert, go upside down in the way they operate, and make the classroom count when proximity is granted back to us. I'll just say that at MIT Open Learning, we created 20 years ago, we created something called OpenCourseWare, which today has had more than 500 million visitors from around the world. OpenCourseWare at MIT.edu, 500 million, which, quite a significant fraction of humanity. We have more than 2,000 courses online. Then we created this thing called MITx, which is online material delivered basically for free. You pay for a certificate, and the certificate's quite inexpensive. We've already had 4 million visitors come to this, enroll. We've given away more than 200,000 certificates. And we, with Harvard, created this entity called edX, which is our platform for serving up the MITx content. It just recently crossed 100 million enrollments. And then we started introducing these new online credentials. In fact, I was the person who created this. It's called the MicroMasters. We have almost 1 million enrollees just at MIT. It's purely online. And edX, I'm sorry, there's a typo there, has tens of millions of enrollments, 50 plus MicroMasters from 25 plus universities on 4 continents. So MIT has done a lot, and in fact, the world is doing a lot in online content. And what universities have to do is not fall back into the trap of giving lectures, but become places of action, places of creation, places of impact. And this to me is the future of education. The world is going to face more crises. Young people have to be prepared and be sort of ninjas, to take on these crises. And the degree will matter, but matter less. Knowledge and ability will matter more. I'll end with this slide. So this is the original charter for the establishment of MIT. It was written in 1861 by our founder, William Barton Rogers. And they created the logo 150 years ago. And if you look at the MIT logo, you see on the left, a man with a sledgehammer, because the whole principle is work with your hands, do stuff. And our motto is mens et manus, mind and hand. The hand is important. And of course, the word technology was only at 30, 40 years old when MIT was established. And they went out of the way to introduce it into the name of the university. And of course, it's science. MIT is on technology and science, but the embrace of the arts is equally important. In all this, I don't want to give the impression that I believe in some utilitarian, unromantic view of the world where the arts and the humanities are not important. It's quite the opposite. They're very important because that's what makes the iPhone, for example, an iPhone. It's such a beautiful piece of art and technology and doing and thinking. So thank you very much. I'll stop there. And I'm at your service if you have any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Sharma. It was a real nice, fantastic talk. And what you were talking about, mind wandering, if a teacher is interesting, if he arises of curiosity, I don't think mind wandering happens. And you have proved it today, no mind wandering was there. And we have many, many questions for you, too many of them, in fact. So I'll hurry up with the questions so that we don't want to leave questions out because you are found very rarely. First question is that this is from Rita Ragnekar. She says, how do we engage the students through intrinsic motivation in online education?
Very interesting question. Part of the problem here is if you take a student who's 15 years old, they've already been through 10 years of classroom, and they're used to the teacher wagging a finger at them. And it's not trivial to get them interested in online education. So this is a gradual thing. So the first important thing is to actually explain to the student that the science that I just described, students are smart enough to get it, and how learning actually works and how the brain works. But the second piece is that you make the online education, the beauty of online education is you can measure what the student did. And you make it you have to do it before you enter the classroom. So when you come into the classroom, you have to do the assessments and show you've done it. And so that's how you sort of enforce it. I hesitate to use the word enforce, but it's got to become a habit.
Thank you.
It's like doing your homework, except it's pre-homework.
So many of them are also asking that how the flipped classroom model works in USA, because in India it's mostly lecture mode. So how does the flipped
It's got
classroom
to
model
change.
work?
Yeah, it's got to change. I think it would be dishonest and disingenuous of me to somehow claim that it has been broadly adopted in the United States. Certainly in the top schools, it is something every professor aspires to. Certainly at MIT, for example, for 20 years, we've taught physics using something called technology-enhanced active learning, which is basically a flipped classroom. It's one of those things that takes a long time to develop, but it has to be, we have to start doing it now.
Yes.
And the problem is the teachers have to do it too, and the students have to learn to do it. And if you don't start doing it now, by the time these students graduate, kids now graduate, the world will have changed, and our education system will be out of sync. It's like medicine. Our medicine has changed. Our teaching has to change.
Thank you. May I request Carl to take the next question, please?
Thank you, Dr. Mittal. And thank you, Dr. Sarma. I understand that we're all forgetting tapeworms with big red foreheads that shoot laser beams out. So no, that was great. You have so much experience in the Indian higher education system as well as the United States. And our audience today is from the Indian higher education system, both vice chancellors, people in politics, professors, students. It's a great group. What would be your top recommendations for Indian higher education? What's the way forward after this crisis?
I think, I'm not a huge fan of Churchill, but I will quote him regretfully and say that this crisis is too good to waste. In other words, for all the ills and the tragedies this crisis has brought to this country and to the world, when students are back, that's the best time to establish a new normal. Don't do the classroom, just change things up. Don't sit the students down on chairs in the classroom. Take them for a walk while you're giving a lecture. Do them outdoors. India's warm and nice, right? If it's a biology lecture, be surrounded by trees. Take them on field trips. You've got to start somewhere, and it's not easy, and some of it will be symbolic. But the fact of the matter is, if you change the setting, first of all, I think we will go back to our human instinct of teaching as if we were parents, and hopefully permitting students to learn as if they are, at home. This, by the way, one of the reasons in the United States why homeschooling is doing well is because it picks up the other modality of learning. And I'll just stop by saying, Carl, that remember, this is a human thing. I think most of us on this call are human. And I was joking. I think that it's a sort of an evolutionary right to learn this way and to teach this way.
Thank you. Dr. Mittal.
Thank you. Dr. Sharma, apart from teaching learning, there is a lot of issues regarding research, and people are worried about international collaborative research. So in this post-COVID world, when there is a lot of restriction in the travel, how do we promote international collaboration for research?
I think that travel is overrated for research. I think that the most important thing for research is world-classness. And given that you can find the latest paper on Google Scholar, and you can talk to people by video conferencing, and most of the research happens in one's mind and in collaborations. I actually think that this business is somehow one needs to land at a university far away and also hurt the environment doing it is misguided. Clearly, the time to travel is when you need access to instrumentation, for example, expensive microscopes, things like that. But even that can be done remotely today. I think the most important thing about research is to own the problem. I'll also say this. My view is that until Indians treat Indian problems as first-class problems, we will always be second-class citizens. Indians need to treat Indian problems as first-class problems and own the problem, earn all the questions about the problem, own the issues about the problem. So I think travel is overrated. In fact, this is the time to do good research.
Maybe it is now cheaper also to have international collaborations because travel cost is reduced.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm sitting in my basement here at home, and I have to say I'm more productive both research-wise. Of course, at some point I'm going to have to go back to the lab than I was while I was commuting an hour each way to work, walking between meetings. No, I think that our complaints are overrated.
Carl?
There's a number of questions from our audience about the internet connectivity throughout India. And so much of this new learning style will be predicated on having easy and excellent access to the internet. In a place like India, which has still so many rural areas without such great connectivity, what's the solution?
I think the internet is the new electricity. We are all hanging by a thread, every one of us on this, in this video conference. We're hanging by the internet, right? COVID has shown us that it is the internet. It is networking. It is information. That's why I call 2021 the beginning of the 21st century, right? Because it suddenly has put into stark contrast the world before and the world after. Even the taking on SARS-CoV-2, the virus, and everything from vaccines to antibodies to sequencing, it's all information. So welcome to the information age, and the internet to me is the most important thing. Obviously healthcare, obviously electricity, obviously water, because we have to keep people healthy and meet their basic needs. But the internet has joined that pantheon of must-dos.
Thank you, Dr. Tom.
Sure. And one thing which worries a lot the students is, as well as the universities in India, is the online examinations. So how do we go in for online examinations, that to proctored online examinations, because there's a lot of issues with regard to safety, security of examinations?
Well, I think, Dr. Mittal, you're being very polite. There's also the issue of cheating. You're concerned about cheating. Let's just say what it is. There's sort of two ways to address it. One is that I actually think the exams can be in person, right? I mean, once COVID has retreated, you do the exams in person. That's, you know, the IIT entrance exam, when it's done, usually is in person. And that's one reason to be in person. But I also think that we have an examination overload, because the exams have become the centerpiece. They've become the North Pole of education. Everything spins around it. Now, what we need to do, in my view, is have more projects. We need to have more creative stuff. We need to have portfolios, assessments, and it's a little less scalable. But all the things I've said that education must do, the in-person part of education, revolves around things that can't be examined with a multiple choice questionnaire. So I do think that we need to rethink exams.
Thank you. There's been some interesting articles that have come out recently about this post-COVID moments being the perfect opportunity for tech giants to come in, where you, instead of having a degree from MIT, you'd have a degree from Google, which would be, they'd already have such a head start in a lot of the aspects that you're talking about in terms of software, online engagements, and using new technologies and new ideas to break the traditional paradigm that's been around since thousands of years. What do you think about that? Is that realistic, or is that just
no, I don't think it's realistic. I would like to see if the CEO of Google or IBM or Netflix sends their kid to Netflix University, right? When that happens, then we should start taking it seriously. There's a conflict of interest here. I do think that a lot of these great companies, with Infosys in India, right, have and will continue to play a very important part in education by providing internships, by providing apprenticeships in Germany, in Austria, in Switzerland, in Denmark, Northern Europe. There's a great apprenticeship program. You get certificates from it. They will provide online content, which is excellent, right? Projects, maybe there'll be mentors, but there's a conflict of interest. And the conflict of interest is this: would you like your doctor to be an independent doctor who cares for you, or a doctor that works with a company that only wants to make sure you're maximally productive for the, while you're at the job, but sort of doesn't care about the rest of your life, right? So the bottom line is that, and I think these great companies do recognize that they want people who are well-grounded, who have critical thinking, et cetera, including in contrarian thinking, contrarian to the company, right? And so I don't believe that that'll be something that'll happen a lot. I do think in some situations it will happen. So for example, Infosys might adopt a local college or a school and give internships. And I think that's fine, but I don't see it on a large scale.
Thank you, Dr. Tom.
Thank you. Dr. Sharma, there's a lot of issues in India with regard to opening of institutions. Like say Cambridge has said that, okay, whole of 2021 we will do online. In India, we have not yet taken such a decision. So what are you doing at MIT or what are US universities doing about it? Are they opening up? If yes, what type of safety measures they are taking? How are they ensuring that the students do not have any problem or maybe the safety issues, especially with regard to health when they come to the university? So what are you doing about it?
First of all, I think that if we do, when we do, let's post-COVID, when we open up, I hope that the universities will rethink what the raison d'etre, why we do in person, as I said in my presentation. Now, during COVID, obviously, these are crazy times, and MIT, you know, we're very blessed because we're a small university and we're very high tech, and we have access to testing, and you know, and we develop our own technology. You know, Moderna is an MIT company that's doing the vaccine and so on. You know, one of our spin-off companies is working on self-testing. So we have a wide range of technologies. Even so, we're opening up very likely with a fraction of our students on campus with extreme social distancing. And a lot of testing and a lot of safety precautions. The problem is that the students themselves are young and not 0%, but there's very unlikely to fall sick, seriously sick, although there was a death recently at Penn State of a student, a young person. The problem is it's the staff and the faculty who are older and they're more exposed. And it's also, there's an equity issue. You know, some of the professors may or may not come in, but the staff are forcibly exposed to this because they have to come in sometimes, you know, and take care of the students and so on. So net, I think this is a very sensitive topic, and I hope that universities will take a responsible approach rather than just going full bore. On the other hand, I know that it's economically a tough time, so I have mixed feelings about it. It's not going to be a pretty fall, let me put it that way.
So that means US universities are opening up physically?
Some are, yeah. Or most US universities, some universities are opening. Some are opening with small fractions of students. I'm talking about undergraduate students. Graduate students can be very careful because they work in labs. And many professional colleges are going fully online, right? For example, a school of law, right? You can do it online. The discussions are online. There's no lab, you know, there's no law lab really. So professional schools are going online. Undergraduate, some schools are opening 100%, unfortunately, but some are opening MIT as well, likely with a fraction of the students.
But then some of the Indian students are worried because there was a news today that if you're going online, if you're doing online education in USA, then you should go back to your own country.
Yeah, that was a circular I just saw last night. It came out of, I haven't read it carefully because it's early in the morning for me, but apparently if you're doing stuff completely online, the United States is saying, then don't be in the US, be in your home country. I haven't read it yet, but I will say that if something's fully online,
there's no need to.
It doesn't matter where you take it from.
Okay. Thank you, Carl.
Thank you. I had another speculation question. In 50 years, what will education look like? Not ideally, but realistically, what kind of changes would you like to, what would you see in 50 years, both in the United States and India? How will it be different?
I think
how fast is this changing?
Well, it's going to change quite rapidly. I think we won't, it's sort of like it's going to change, but we won't see changing, and then suddenly we'll wake up one day and go, oh my God, you know, things were so different 10 years ago. So I think we will go backwards in time. Let me explain how. So do you think Michelangelo ever attended a lecture? There's a great book on the Masters of the Renaissance by Vasari, and it's worth reading. It was written around the same time, by the way. He didn't attend a lecture. He didn't go sit in a classroom with a professor boring him with, you know, something about how to hold a chisel, right, or hold a brush. So my view is that we will have to rethink our universities, and we need to look at every young person or an older person, because universities will have to get into adult continuous education, in my view. We will have to look at every one of them as a potential superstar. Almost like a cricket coaching camp. You know, you have a young Tendulkar or a young Anil Kumble. I mean, look at these incredibly talented people, right? How do you turn them into the superstars that you need to turn them into? And so I think that that's how universities should be viewed. Now, the tools, were how they do the lectures, whether it's online, whether how they do the coaching, exposure to the real world, et cetera, that should be wrapped around this fundamental goal, which is how do I turn this person into the most successful superstar they can be?
Fascinating. Thank you. Dr. Tom?
Dr. Sharma, you mentioned about MicroMasters, that you have started MicroMasters in USA. Many of our Indian students do not exactly know what is MicroMasters. Would you mind explaining it a bit?
Yeah, and I also see in the notes a question about foreign Indians not Indian universities not accepting foreign qualifications and so on. You know, there is a good reason to be very strict about credentials, foreign qualifications, because they can be abused. But the fear of abuse of these things should not freeze us as humanity or as a country in the face of definite change. We can be like deers in the headlights when these changes are upon us. In answer to your question, Dr. Mittal, about the MicroMasters, so we just made it up in 2015. We announced it, what we did. And this is MIT, right? It's not, we said, excellent professional one-year masters, like in supply chain management. We started with supply chain management. And so the head of that program, Professor Yossi Sheffi, and we said, let's take then, and this is a crazy thing. We said, no admissions. Anyone can take it. And we call it inverted admissions. So rather than admitting students at the beginning of the first year when we don't really can't see what the students' credentials are, whether they can cut it at MIT, exam at the end of the first semester, 4 courses. And if they do well, then we will admit them. Okay. So it's inverted admissions. But if they do well, and they don't get admitted, even if they don't, we'll give them a certificate called a MicroMasters. And the top 30 or 40, we will admit to MIT.
Okay.
Now, if we have 4 MicroMasters, 5 MicroMasters now, almost 1 million people enrolled. You can see how distilled the talent is when we do admit it. And then a whole bunch of other universities came to us and said, can we admit students you don't admit? So we said, well, they want, sure. Now we have more than 100 people from this MicroMasters program. Right? Now just imagine if we'd been held by the fear of abuse, would not have progressed. But we just made it up, and the president
so that type of autonomy the US universities have
in India.